Hello, Eco 701, Lecture 9. So we open slides 11. Now we go back to the remaining part of Literature Review Chapter 2. Remember, in one of the earlier lectures, we look at some past students' examples on how they wrote the definition of key concepts session and the theoretical framework session. Then we move on to the last part, which is the review of past empirical studies. Then we will look at some past students' examples. So we can look at the first example, Franzmann 2017. And before I look at these students' examples, please follow the lecture speech notes. Okay? I repeat for the last time, the videos are supposed to give you summary highlights, actually. You must first start off with the lecture speech notes, and then you make an effort to read the readings before you watch my highlight videos. So if we look at the Franzmann study, I think it is on non-money metric, multi-dimensional poverty. And then if we look at her review of past empirical studies, okay, I think this is the issue. She has a very, very long session to review the money metric poverty studies, and then a session to review the non-money metric poverty studies. But remember, her topic relates to non-money metric poverty. So actually, this session 3.2, you can see a lot of subsessions. So maybe there is actually not a need to have such a long session 3.2. So I'm just assuming I try to be very picky and very strict. So if we argue that, or we ask a question, is there any room for improvement? The answer is yes. So this is my suggestion. Okay, so if you go to the first page of the lecture speech notes, maybe for the review of past empirical studies, start off with one paragraph just to briefly say, oh, there is an abundance of empirical studies examining money metric poverty levels and trends using different data sources. And then just list the data sources, and then in brackets, the name of these studies. Okay, and then just briefly summarize all the general findings of these money metric poverty studies is that money metric poverty increased in the 1990s before a downward trend has been taking place since 2000. But this session rather would focus on reviewing the recent local empirical studies on multidimensional non-money metric poverty. And then I have some suggestion, why not having the subsessions? First, review the studies using methods other than MPI. She used the MPI method called Multidimensional Poverty Index approach. So I would recommend 3.4.1 reviews the past empirical studies on non-money metric poverty, but using method other than MPI. Then for 3.4.2, she can particularly focus on reviewing the findings of past studies on non-money metric poverty using MPI. And she can review this study X, Y, and Z, and then in the last paragraph to conclude, there is only a handful of studies. So that implies the research gap. There is only a handful of studies using the MPI method to examine multidimensional poverty in South Africa. And these studies hardly look at what happened by the smaller geographical units, such as municipality and district council. And this is why the Tina Franzmann study wants to fill this research gap. She wants to look at multidimensional poverty by municipality and district council. So this is the first one. And then if we look at the second one by Nakadin, my other master's students, he looked at formal-informal sector linkages in the labor market. It's about people moving in and out of the two sectors. And then if you look at his literature review of past empirical study, he has 3 subsessions. He reviewed a lot of studies on characteristics, profile of informal sector workers and the size of the informal sector workers. And then it is correct to examine the studies looking at formal-informal sector linkages, and then the next subsession looking at barriers to enter the formal and informal sector. So if I am very picky, very strict, I ask if there is a way to improve session 2.4. Maybe I will start off with 1 paragraph or 2 paragraphs just to briefly highlight the studies on profile of informal sector workers and then the barriers. And then I would rather focus specifically on studies, reviewing studies that look at the formal-informal labor market sector linkage. So if I go back to the lecture speech notes, okay, this is my suggestion. I will start off with one or two brief paragraphs. There is an abundance of empirical studies on informal sectors in two areas. First, studies such as estimate the number of informal sector workers and derive the profile of these workers. And the general conclusion of these studies was that informal sector employment size hovering around that range. And the profile of the informal sector workers are mainly self-employed African females involving in unskilled occupations and so forth. And then I name the studies in bracket. And then the second group of studies investigate the main barriers of entry to the informal sectors. And these studies are named up in brackets, identify the following as the main barriers: high crime rate, But this session would rather review the rare local studies that examine informal and formal sector linkages. Then I really move on with the comprehensive review. First of all, study by Okay, I think that could be a better approach actually. And then to conclude, none of the existing studies on formal-informal sector linkages use the panel data, national income dynamic studies, to examine workers' transition between the two sectors over time. So this is the research gap that this study aims to fill. Okay, and then for the last example, the Christian example, I would just open the PDF file. I just want to look at the structure. So I think this is the correct approach. She has subsection to review the past studies. Remember, her topic has to do with health economics on the access dimension on healthcare. So she has subsection 3.2.1, reviewing past empirical studies that look at the availability dimension. Next subsection, looking at the results of empirical studies, examining the affordability dimension. And then the last one on the acceptability dimension. So I think this is quite a nice approach. And then again, when you have time, please go through my lecture speech notes, okay? Okay, and then for the last two readings, Feder and Fredericks. Okay, and then these are the two additional sources that give you as an example on how to write the methods and data chapter. Remember that relates to the I think we previously had a lecture on that, methods and data. Okay, so these are the two additional examples. Okay, and then I think that's it from the slides. Okay, and then do we have a writing workshops? No, I don't need to save the file. And then for practice 09, oh, I've already done practice 09, how to improve the structure of the Franzmann and the Nakadin review of past empirical study session. So I'm actually done with this lecture number 9.